It's really a great pleasure for me to speak to such an august gathering of people who all have an interest in the Resource Management Act. This statute is now a massive statute, much bigger than it was when it was first passed. That indeed is one of its problems, and its complexity, of course, provides you all with work. But it also has other features that are very important. And I do want to say that for people interested in the Resource Management Act, you are living in not only interesting times, but highly challenging times, because change for the Act is in the air, and the changes that are proposed will affect your work in vital and, I suggest, important ways. And they will also affect the environment. And I think that that is a matter of very considerable moment. And this address is called the Resource Management Act, How We Got It, and What Changes Are Being Made to It. But before I address that issue, I want to bring to your attention a judgment of the High Court Justice Coase in the Horticulture New Zealand and the Manawatu-Wanganui Regional Council, a decision that came out on the 24th of December. It's a decision that upheld the Environment Court's decision virtually in its entirety. And it was about, of course, the proposed one plan case. And it is therefore of utmost importance to you all, and I suggest as well that it is an important precedent in this area because it involved decisions, 19 questions of law that were determined by the High Court, because you can only appeal, of course, from the Environment Court on a point of law on a matter of this sort. And the judgment is of great importance. I just want to read 2 or 3 paragraphs of it to you. Justice Coase says, nitrogen forms the greatest part of the atmosphere we live within. It is an essential element in the growth of plants and in the formation of proteins in plants and animals. That is the reason why nitrogen-based fertilisers are applied to aid the growth of crops, vegetables and grasses. Animal feed and excreta also contain nitrogen. But plants and animals do not capture all available fixed nitrogen. Large amounts can run into the water system. There, it can cause eutrophication, the overloading of waterways with nutrients, causing growth of algae, hypoxia, depletion of oxygen, affecting fish and animal life adversely, and the problems associated with nitrogen leaching greatly exceed those of other macronutrients. The judge goes on to say, it is said by the appellants that the reforms contained in the plan go too far. One of the appellants describes the thrust of the new scheme as too aspirational and distant from the reality of the Manawatu-Wanganui region, a region whose economy is based on rural-based activities, most particularly farming. The appellants prefer the more limited and more practical version of the scheme recommended by an independent hearings panel in 2010. But that more limited approach was set aside by the Environment Court in 2012. The appellants identify what they say are a number of errors of law in the court's decisions. The respondent counsel and the other parties disagree. They say that the court did not err in law in reinstating the original scope of the scheme first notified by the council in 2007. They say that in reinstating the scheme in that form, proper effect is given to Section 5 of the Act, promoting of sustainable management of natural and physical resources, while safeguarding the life-supporting capacity of air, water and soil. So it's very important, I think, to also take note of the fact that the judge quotes the 2004 Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report, which, it was said in the decision, greatly influenced the thinking of the Council. it noted that farming in New Zealand was becoming more intensive, that it involved the use of inputs, fertiliser, energy, water, knowledge and capital, and it now produced more food from the same area of land. The report undertook a detailed examination of the issue of nitrogen and freshwater resources. It noted a substantial increase in synthetic fertiliser usage across most farming sectors. Use of nitrogen fertiliser was said to have soared, and the report considered that intensive farming needed to be put on a more sustainable footing. In the short term, the Commissioner for the Environment said New Zealand needs to move rapidly to a situation where all farmers are using nutrient management plans and tools which balance nutrient inputs with plant intake and minimise nutrient outputs which cause environmental damage. Now, I suggest that this decision has great importance, and it should be the subject of debate, I think, at this meeting, because you are, in fact, the people who make this law work. It requires a combination of skills to make the Resource Management Act work. But in my opinion, Justice Coase has reached the correct legal conclusions. I would judge the decision to be appeal-proof. And the issue for consideration is what would be the result of the same case if the RMA changes proposed by the government had gone through? Now, that's not an easy question to answer, and I don't intend to analyse it, but it's an important issue. It could, I think, especially if the water reforms proposed were brought in, be very different. I think because it is a clear government policy to have the intensification of agriculture as an engine of economic growth, that what this decision indicates is that the environmental consequences of that are heavy and serious. Now, having said that, I just want to now turn to the theme of my address. Obviously, the Resource Management Act is now about 22 years old, and it contains a mixture of difficult issues: constitutional issues, environmental policy issues, and economic questions. And obviously, under this Act, hard choices are involved. And the character of the choices that this Act deals with, and indeed the economic philosophies that swirl around it, these things recur in New Zealand's history. From the echoes of the Think Big debate, which have already been mentioned in opening, obviously governments of all political persuasions strive to produce economic growth and jobs and wealth so that people can have economic security. That's quite understandable. And those pressures always become much more strident and difficult at the time when economic adversity hits us, as it has in the last few years, even though none of the global financial meltdown was the result of New Zealand's activities. It nevertheless is something that we have to suffer. And often in those sort of situations in New Zealand, governments resort to frenetic legislative activity, drastically changing regulatory frameworks in order to produce the desired result. Yet, you know, almost always the performance does not produce the outcome wished for. So we have to be very, very careful when we adjust massive regulatory statutes that in fact we are going to achieve something that is desirable. Now, I do want to say, in relation to the changes that have been visited upon the Resource Management Act in the last few years, I can see no comprehensive empirical research that has been undertaken to find out what the effects of the Act have been in fact, so that the remedies introduced can deal with proved and demonstrated problems. As so often is the case in the life of our public policy here in New Zealand, we proceed on the basis of assertion, pressure group activity and anecdote, and then we throw all our toys out of the cot in order to produce a new regime that it is asserted will perform better. And governments in New Zealand always think they know best. And so the result is that you often get legislation that is hurried, that is lacking in coherence, that has internal contradictions, that soon has to be amended. And of course, the difficulty is that, as I've indicated, the Resource Management Act is now much more than twice its original length. Well, how did we get to this point? Well, everything in New Zealand can be traced back, in so far as the Resource Management Act is concerned, to the National Development Act. And because so many professionals in the Resource Management Act area now are so youthful, it is necessary to explain to you that we must not forget the lessons of history, our own history, some of it quite recent. The think big philosophy of the 1980s produced the National Development Act, 1979. That was a very controversial piece of legislation. It proposed to suspend the operations of a number of major statutes and provide consents that were effectively given by the minister. It was a fast-track act. It was to reduce New Zealand's dependence on foreign oil, and 28 Acts of Parliament were to have their provisions swept aside for this new fast track. The other thing that the bill, as it was introduced, did was to almost entirely remove the role of the courts in ruling on the government's decisions about national development. And it said, the bill, that you couldn't challenge an order in council that was made under it. Now, this was a massively unconstitutional piece of legislation. As a former constitutional law professor, I just arrived in Parliament and it was like manna from heaven and I loved it. But it made me focus on the environment for the first time, and I became very interested in the environmental issues that were replete in this whole debate. The parliamentary battle about it involved a terrific amount of urgency. We didn't have urgency with sleep in those days. We had proper urgency, Muldoon style, where you sat and sat and sat. Marilyn Waring came into the House with a pillow and a blanket. And the opposition opposed this extremely vigorously. There were 47 divisions in the Committee of the Whole. There were 10 amendments moved. Actually, I moved an amendment in which 3 National MPs voted for. I felt very proud of that. They were Ian Shearer, Michael Minogue and Marilyn Waring. But it was a very bad bill. It was oppressive, it was unjust, it sort of ran a great bus through the rule of law, and it was designed to keep the courts out of questioning everything. And of course it was massively amended in the Select Committee. It was finally passed, but it was hardly ever used. And that's a really interesting feature of it. We had a continuation of that sort of issue with the Clutha, in which the Clutha River had the capacity, of course, to generate a lot of hydroelectricity. And in 1977, the government decided it wanted to get a water right, and it applied in the normal way. Then it found it very difficult and was frustrated in that sense. And so then it was decided to abandon that process and implement it, do it by legislation. That was the end of the Social Credit Political League when they supported that. And the government had to look to the Social Credit Political League because it did not have the numbers in its own ranks to carry it. So that was a massive environmental and constitutional battle, because there were problems with the question of getting consents. There were so many different statutes, there were so many different standards. It was a bureaucratic nightmare of considerable proportions to be able to get anything done. The National Development Act was one answer to that problem, but the question was it acceptable? And it wasn't. And the incoming government was pledged to repeal it, and we did. But you do have to understand the contrapuntal harmonies that dominate New Zealand politics, or they did under first past the post. And of course the origins of the Resource Management Act lie in the National Development Act, because the opposition said, well, if we're not going to have that, what are we going to have? What is it that we should do to deal with this problem? And so of course, we had the wonderful late lamented Ministry of Works in those days. Now, the Ministry of Works did a lot of building of dams. They did a lot of that. And they also had a water and soil division. And they had a planning division. And they had massive internal conflicts of interest and fights about which branch of the department would prevail on a particular issue. We see that some of that is not altogether absent in departments now. The result was that we abolished the Ministry of Works. We took the Water and Soil Division and the Planning Division and put it in the new Ministry for the Environment, and took a lot of money to launch the Resource Management Law Reform Project, which was a massive project to try and design a statute that would, in fact, cure the problems but adhere to principle and not provide government by fiat, as the National Development Act had done. Now, there was a massive amount of public consultation about this. It was a really open and long process. So long, in fact, that by the time we got to the end of it, the people who were being consulted sort of got fatigue, and they said, look, we're sick of being consulted, just pass it. It was a policy on which both the government and the opposition were somewhat divided, because the opposition, at that time, conservative rural communities, were never coordinated or given a political spearhead in the way that the conservation movement was. It was a holistic reform that concerned matters of considerable complexity, and it actually never really gained what one has called traction or political sex appeal. The Resource Management Act is a bit of a showstopper, except to an audience like this, of course, it just didn't really register in public consciousness as a prime political issue. When it was introduced, it was a massive bill, 314 pages, and the problems were really that there were, before that, no consistent set of resource management objectives. There were arbitrary differences between land, air and water. There were too many agencies involved with overlapping responsibilities. Consent procedures were very costly, and there were a lot of delays. Pollution laws were ad hoc, and they didn't sort of coordinate between land, air and water. There wasn't enough flexibility. Maori interests were inadequately protected, and monitoring of the existing law, as is so often is the case in New Zealand. We love to pass laws, but we don't like to enforce them. We haven't got the money. We just don't want to really find out what the effect of what we did is. So we hardly ever research what we did. We just pass another law. Not a good habit. Well, in the bill wasn't passed before the election, and in the general election, Labor was defeated. The National Government formed the new government, and the new Minister for the Environment, Simon Upton, took up the Act. The bill, as it then was, he appointed a group of experts, and they published a report. Then there was a review in February 1991. Some drafting amendments were made, but the general thrust of the Act was supported and it was passed. So it started life as a bipartisan measure, which in a first past the post parliament was a really important feature. But there were formidable policy issues in this, and apart from the domestic considerations that I've just outlined, there were important international inputs into this legislation, and that tends to be forgotten now, and I just want to go through them. In the wake of decolonisation, international discussion had moved to the need for development because previously colonised third world countries were suffering from a lot of poverty. But the environmental impact of industrial development in the advanced countries was also becoming far too clear. And there were a series of international conferences and agreements to try and deal with these issues. Central among them was the World Commission on Environment and Development, chaired by the Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. And in 1987, a very important report was issued called Our Common Future. And it said this: failures to manage the environment as a sustained development threaten to overwhelm all countries. Environment and development are not separate challenges, they are inexorably linked. Development cannot subsist upon a deteriorating environmental resource base. The environment cannot be protected when growth leaves out of account the costs of environmental destruction. These problems cannot be treated separately by fragmented institutions and policies. They are linked in a complex system of cause and effect. And what that report set out to do was to provide a framework that would promote economic and social advancement in ways that would avoid environmental degradation and over-exploitation. In many ways, the thrust of it was to protect the interests of future generations so that the resource base was not destroyed in a manner that they could not support themselves. Now, this was a very influential international report. It formed the basis of the Earth Summit in 1992 at Rio, which I was privileged to attend. And 25 years on, the concept of sustainable development remains a central paradigm of development. And it's been reaffirmed time and again by the United Nations, including New Zealand, most recently at the Rio +20 meeting. And although the precise definition varies, it retains at its heart the key concept of development within the capacity of the environment. And that's why the Act says, and it's always said, the purpose of this Act is to promote the sustainable management of natural and physical resources. And that is the lead principle in Part 2 of the Act. Part 2 of the Act is the engine room. It's quite short, 3 or 4 pages of the statute book, but it drives every decision under the Resource Management Act by every decision maker: courts, councils, developers, officials, everyone. Now, the important thing to understand is that it only consists of 4 provisions, sections 5 to 8. And sections 6, 7 and 8 are principles of varying importance intended to give guidance in the way the purpose is to be achieved. And there was a very lengthy process of analysis, public consultation and debate about it. Now, looking back, there are some things about the Resource Management Act that I would like to say. The first is that it was at the very limits of what could be achieved by a law reform project. It was very ambitious. It was, at the time that it was passed, extremely progressive legislation, although New Zealand has now sadly fallen behind in this regard, and our environmental laws have many gaps. And we are in the course of losing, I suggest, our clean green image. And that is very sad. I also think that successive governments, both National and Labor, failed the Resource Management Act in important ways. They did not provide enough guidance from central government on vital matters. The Act has always contained ample scope for measures of national policy statements and the power to provide environmental standards, policy statements and plans. Now, only by May this year, only 3 national policy statements had been made. 5 sets of national environmental standards had been promulgated. I've never been able to understand why more action was not taken. Much of the policy negligence, I think, stems from the attitude of leave it to the market. But one can't leave to the market pollution, and the reason is that the problem of externalities is the central problem of environmental economics. And you simply can't leave it to pressure groups to push you around on things of that sort. What has happened, I think, in New Zealand is that the development lobby has spent a lot of energy convincing people that the Resource Management Act is a very big, bad bogeyman that stops them achieving good things. This isn't built on research, it's built on anecdote, and indeed there have been many reviews of the Act over the years, most of them quick and dirty, and the 3-year parliamentary term has a lot to answer for in that regard because things are done too quickly and with inadequate background work. So there's been a lot of spin on all of this, and indeed in the opinion that has already been mentioned, which is 60 pages that I spent 2 or 3 months writing for the New Zealand Fish and Game Council, I've tried to analyse carefully all the material about Part 2. I've looked at all the literature, and I've carried out what is a serious economic analysis, not economic analysis, legal analysis, completely devoid of any political statements of the sort I've just been making, to try and produce a rigorous legal opinion about what the effects of the changes to Part 2 will be. And that seems to me to be the most important issue, although there are a lot of important issues, in the changes that the government is proposing. Now, one of the things that worries me the most about the processes that have been gone through here is that all the documents that have been produced lack analytical depth and rigour. They lack research. They lack the sort of policy bases upon which serious policies ought to be developed. And that is why I wrote a legal opinion of this character, to supply what I thought was a dreadful lack in the government's published documents, which appear to me to be more driven by spin doctors than policy analysis. The real difficulty seems to me to be that the changes have been justified by reference to assumptions and perceptions that are not supported by empirical evidence or analysis. They are unnecessary. They will inevitably lead to uncertainty and increased costs. They were objected to by 99% of the public submitters. I've been through all those submissions which are available. And it really is not sufficient to dismiss those concerns from experts, councils, iwis, individual and environmental organisations as, quote, howls of outrage from some of those that have made a nice industry from the very complexity we are seeking to address. So there is a serious set of deficits when it comes to policy development in relation to these changes. And it doesn't seem to me to be surprising that New Zealand First, the Maori Party and United Future will not support the changes to Part 2. And I hope that that position remains. The truth of the matter is that the New Zealand environment has deteriorated in quality markedly, especially in relation to water, in the 22 years since this Act has been in existence. Our environmental quality is getting worse, not better, and yet this Act is going to be changed in a manner that relaxes the environmental standards still further and elevates economic considerations in a way that goes totally against the principle that Gro Harlem Brundtland set out in our common future and upon which the Act is based. It's not a question of elevating the economic factors. And of course, when you weaken environmental standards, the result is going to be, in the long term, disastrous. And that is something that seems to me to be, has not yet reached the level of public visibility. The Act has already been tipped too far in favour of development. And if you look at the environmental indicators that we have, we are not getting better. And we have a lot of environmental problems that we didn't have when this Act was passed in 1991. Now, of course, it's not just central government's failure to provide and use the tools in the Act that they have failed to use. Local government has very important responsibilities for the administration of this Act, and in many ways local government found this very difficult, and it was a big challenge to them. And the reason it was a challenge partly lay in the fact that central government provided no guidance. It left them alone. It didn't use the tools that I have already mentioned. But local government didn't do as well, I think, as it should have done. And indeed, when I looked at the structures of local government in Wellington in 2012, on a panel I chaired, I found a plethora of complicated interlocking plans of great complexity generated by each separate local authority. And we recommended there a single plan for the region. And I think that that's the sort of tendency that will have to be looked at. There are a number of procedural things that you can do that will help the bureaucratic tendencies or ameliorate them of the Resource Management Act. But it is, I think, a great mistake to think that you can pass a big, long statute with a whole lot of processes set out that everyone has to jump through. The complexity becomes such that if you try and legislate all the procedures, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. And I think the Resource Management Act has become top-heavy with procedural requirements. And that often doesn't produce any adherence to principle. But what we are talking about at base here is an economic philosophy which is based on the pragmatic view that if environmental restrictions are eased, the economy will benefit and jobs will be generated. Now, the problem is that that is very similar to the ideas that drove Think Big. But this legislative proposal here has none of the evil constitutional tendencies of Think Big and the National Development Act. What it has is a much different set of considerations which are subtle but which will in the end be fatal. So what I have said in this opinion, which will be available to you, which is long and analytical, is that the environmental protection offered by the Act is going to be weakened by these changes to Part 2, and no amount of assertion or assurance can change that analytical fact. And furthermore, the journey to finding out the precise consequences will be long, expensive and uncertain, because there now are many judicial precedents about how to approach the interpretation of Part 2, And if you change the words, if you put another lot of other factors in and take quite a lot of the existing ones out, and you destroy the hierarchy between 6, 7 and 5, then the result of that is going to be legal uncertainty, journeys to the courts, costs and uncertainty, and indeed the government's own analysis in one document recognises that. Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, why would you want to do that? What are you trying to achieve, and what will you achieve? So I think the proposals to rewrite 6 and 7 will actually imperil the achievement of sustainable management. And I think the level of legal protection for the natural environment is going to be reduced by those changes, and they are not supported by any empirical evidence. And I am very worried about the future of this statute if they go ahead. I recently have written my memoirs, which I spent a lot of time on dealing with the environmental issues that I encountered as Minister for the Environment, and I really enjoyed being Minister for the Environment. It was a new experience for me, and I've had a big interest in international environmental law ever since that I still teach at the university, and I've taught it overseas and do a textbook in American law schools about it. And it is a fascinating field, but just remember that this statute had important parts of its origins in the international obligations that the international community agreed to about sustainability. We ought not to throw that away. Thank you very much. Now I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey, for that context and that reminder of the background to the reforms that we're now facing. Could you comment on the overall judgment approach to Section 5 that the courts have applied reasonably consistently, and that is at the forefront of the proposed new Section 6?
Yes, the long opinion that I have gone into says you have to be very careful about taking one phrase out of judgments and putting it in a piece of legislation and expecting the results to be the same if you change the number of words and the factors that are there. If you put new factors into a statute like this, the courts will be obliged to give weight to them. And the consequences of that are, to a large extent, very clear. And those consequences are that economic considerations will trump environmental considerations on many occasions. That seems to me to be the unstated purpose of the change, and I do not believe that you can justify it, as the Minister has sought to do, on the basis that that is what the courts do now.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Just a very short, quick question. If you were doing the RMA today, would you do anything different?
Yes, I'd put mandatory policy statements in it so that you couldn't not do them.
And I'd get rid of amenity.
I wouldn't. I relied on it to stop someone building out my view.
No. I'm Bob Nixon with Plans Consultants in Christchurch. Talking about one of the boring aspects of the changes, which is the removal of Section 7C and 7F. We've been told by the proponents of that all will be well because the courts will rely on Section 5.2c to cover the gap. Do you share that confidence?
No, I emphatically do not, because when you enumerate matters in a statute, local authorities, when they are ticking their boxes and going through their plans and trying to do their work, they actually look at those things, and if you take them out, they'll be out of mind and they won't happen. And the idea that they are contained within the generic provisions of Section 5 seems to me to be idle. There is a hierarchy between Section 5, 6, 7, and that hierarchy has been of considerable utility, I think, in the preparation of plans. And I think that the difficulty I have with the government's analysis is that there isn't any analysis. It's assertion.
Hi, I'm Claire Wooding from Local Government New Zealand. We recently commissioned Dr. Hon Somerville to have a look at the changes around 6 and 7 and to provide us with some legal advice. And he's identified particular problems with the new 7D around private property rights.
Yes.
In terms of A, its location in Part 2, but also that it's very ambiguous and will lead to a lot of questions for the courts.
There's no question that analysis is correct. When we did the Resource Management Act, it was the view of many people then that it involved what we call regulatory takings. That is to say that it involved expropriation of private property because it regulated the use which you could make of it. And of course it does do that, but it's only a very extreme interpretation of property rights that would allow you to say that that should be permitted. Now, the result of that provision to which you've just made reference will be that somehow or other private property rights will run rampant over environmental standards in some respects. And that seems to me to be very wrong. And I do think that I just don't believe that there is evidence to support much of what is proposed here. It is done on the basis of anecdote, rumour, conversation and feelings about how things could be better. That is not the way to make public policy in New Zealand. There's been a degradation of our policy-making processes within government in recent years, not just the result of this government's activities. And indeed, one of the things that I'm saying in my memoirs is that there should be a Royal Commission into the public service. And some of the developments that are going on right now in relation to the environment would indicate why that might be so.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a question that follows on from that one? A serious question, and I'll wear my local government hat here.
Yeah.
You point about an abrogation or an intrusion on private property rights. That's been going on for years, in a sense, ever since planning became a mechanism back in the 18th century or even earlier. But what about the proposition, in the Waitaki at the moment, we're wrestling with the Mackenzie Sustainable Futures Trust, and the argument that we get is you're making the individual property owner pay for the public good. The public good is the landscape or the scenery or the view or the important part of indigenous vegetation or whatever. If it's so important for everyone to have that, make everyone pay for it. Don't make me pay for it. Don't inhibit my property right and entitlement to operate my land for the public good without compensating me in some way. Is that an issue that still remains unresolved or inequitable?
Well, the taking of private property is governed by the Public Works Act, and there is a system of compensation when the Crown or local government takes private property for a public work, and that law is well established and long established. The difficulty in New Zealand is that there's an approach that public things such as water, people want to appropriate that as a private good. And the problem with that is that you end up with a system where you sort of capitalise your losses and socialise your you socialise your losses and capitalise your gains. And that really is what is happening to some degree in relation to the use of water, it seems to me. And intensification of agriculture is going to lead to a whole series of considerable environmental difficulties which will in fact consume a lot of, produce a lot of disputes. And I don't think that changing the law in that regard is going to stop the intensity of the disputes. There is in the New Zealand identity a pretty strong strand of feeling that lakes, sea, water, rivers need to be kept so that people can use them, that all the public can use them, and that the activities that occur on private land that have a serious consequence for those waterways have to be controlled. The interesting thing about the water reforms in this proposal is that there is, and the water reforms are still obscure to some extent, but it's clear from the material that I've looked at that you can take down the quality of water in a number of areas so long as you keep to a minimum, and it's not yet said what the minimum standard is. And the result is that it's clear on the face of the documents that have been released so far that the quality of a number of waterways could decline further. Now, that doesn't seem to me to be in the nature of the New Zealand ethos.
Yeah, Peter Wilson, Federated Mountain Clubs. What do you think of the role or the potential future role for, say, a public environmental defender's office? Because I note at the moment most of the environmental defence in this country is being borne by a very small group of NGOs or effectively private individuals and community groups who are worked pretty much to the bone at the moment on this stuff, with our large organisations such as the Department of Conservation being hamstrung. So I just thought that was an idea that I think the time might have come for it.
Yeah, I think the idea does have merit. I was involved in the legislation that led to the setting up of the Department of Conservation, and we went through the exercise of giving that department an advocacy role that could trump even the government's preferences. Now, that statute seems to have become rather inoperative in ways that I don't quite understand the reasons for. But the point was to try and provide some public protection of that sort. The NGOs in New Zealand do a very good job. I mean, I did find when I was Minister for the Environment involved in for example, in drift net fishing, that I got material from the international NGOs that was not available to the government because they know things. And that's true in the domestic level as well. And NGOs can be very helpful in keeping politicians upright.
Bryce Johnson, Fish and Games. Geoffrey, you mentioned before in your presentation of the National Development Act that it was designed to keep the courts out of decisions. And I sense that could be the same direction we're going in now. I mean, this current love affair with collaboration is pretty frightening stuff, and what a lot of us aren't clear about is how decision-making will still be able to be sort of heard in a proper cross-examine type process. Do you have a view on that?
I do think, I didn't, in the opinion that I wrote, get into the position of the Environment Court because I think the court has done a very fine job in a very difficult statute. And the Environment Court has a most unusual set of responsibilities here. And it carries them out faithfully. Efforts to try and clip the wings of the court are very undesirable because in the end, what you have to have is a statute that adheres to the law. And the people who decide that it does is the Environment Court. And I am critical of a number of the issues here where the court is going to have a lesser role. There are efforts to try and cut down the ability to get there. Now, those can be the subject of serious effort at the Select Committee stage if the bill reaches that stage, but there is a whole other set of questions about what the appropriate role of the Environment Court is, because actually there is quite a lot of resistance, as I read it, all these documents, to what they call the judicialisation of policy. I think that what we're talking about is the rule of law here. And that is something that you have to be careful about when you're talking about collaborative outcomes, because you may have a collaborative outcome that is not in accordance with the statutory requirements. And in the end, you really can only have one law. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the officials draft this material or try to. I feel very sorry for the Ministry for the Environment officials. It seems to me they've been landed with mission impossible, and achieving impossible is always required if you're a minister.
Sir Geoffrey, tēnā koe o te anora, tēnā tātou katoa. Esta tini rau ngā rauru. I was just wondering what your view was with respect to the Treaty of Waitangi claims and the reports of the Waitangi Tribunal, and how that has impacted on the resource management reforms, indeed the first act that came in 1991, and how that's changed over time. Kia ora.
Well, I think the Resource Management Act was designed. There was a person called Shane Jones who was the Maori advisor to me on the Resource Management Act, and we got Maori Marsden down, who told us that the thing to do when you were designing the statute was not to confer ownership in any things like water, or you'd have a terrific trouble with the Maori community. And we took that advice, and so there is no proprietorial rights in the statute. It's a question of use being governed of the resources. And I think the Waitangi Tribunal has really done a fine job in articulating the grievances of Maori under the Treaty of Waitangi Act, and providing redress, and it's been one of the more successful elements of our public policy in New Zealand in recent years, and it's wildly bipartisan, which is really very good. I don't have any criticism to make of the Waitangi Tribunal in relation to resource management. Of course, the tribunal is a recommendatory body. It does not make decisions except in a very narrow range of cases where it does have the power to make them, and has done that once. But I feel that the statute, the design of the statute, is unusual in the New Zealand statute book for encompassing so many Maori concepts in the Maori terms in the statute itself. There aren't very many statutes that do that. And that was done because the Maori community have a particular regard. It wasn't long after the Waitara outfall case, and if you read the Waitangi Tribunal decision on that, you can see that Maori concerns about the environment are in many respects deeper than the Pākehā community have for the same sort of problem. And the Motunui outfall was such a case. Now, I do think that the statute is Maori friendly in a way that the previous law was not, and that does allow Maori aspirations for the environment to be weighed, and weighed properly, and there are a lot of decisions in the Environment Court where that has happened.
Well, who better than Sir Geoffrey Palmer to give us a commentary on where we are with the state of play with the RMA proposed reforms at the moment, particularly on the changes to Section 2, from his history, his involvement in the past, and his understanding of the current situation. As a former Prime Minister and former Minister for the Environment, we're certainly very privileged, honoured to have you here today, Sir Geoffrey, with your comments. We've had the opportunity to ask some questions of you. We're certainly very grateful for your responses. I'd like to offer you a token of our appreciation for your efforts today. Thank you.